Left-wing Brexit. Why should we leave the single market? Now, the single market seeks to guarantee free movement of goods, capital, services and labour. So there's a bit of crossover with freedom of movement there, but I'll talk about that one later. But the single market, in my view, seems to be pushing the entire European continent into a wild west of unregulated private companies running public services and an end to workers' rights and our ability to organise, as we're all forced to compete for jobs with ever-falling wages and worsening conditions. But it also seems the single market was designed in the interest of giant corporations who, rather than the idea of a free market where apparently plucky entrepreneurs have a go at bringing new ideas to the table, generally public assets and services tend to fall into the hands of cronyist monopolies, as we saw after the Thatcher era and continually under David Cameron. This just means we end up with an unaccountable corporate state like Behemoth running everything for profit instead of an elected democratic one. Now, why do I think this? It's mainly because participation in the single market actively drives wages down and shifts the failings of mega companies onto ordinary workers. A good example of this is in 2011, the member states passed something called the Euro Plus Pact. Now, this was an emergency measure to try and combat the effects of the banking crisis in 2008. And there's two parts of this agreement which are particularly awful for workers. Both are in the labour cost reducing measures section of the pact. The first one is reforming the wage setting arrangements and, where necessary, adjusting the degree of centralisation in the bargaining process and the wage indexation mechanisms. Now, wage indexation mechanisms are the relation between wages and the cost of living through inflation. So essentially this is giving bosses a green light to not increase wages in line with inflation, which is essentially giving workers a pay cut in real terms. And the bargaining process here that refers to trade unions, which in my opinion are the best thing in this day and age that workers have to protect and improve working conditions and pay against greedy bosses who just want to squeeze us for every penny. So if they do try and cut our pay, the EU doesn't want us to have the legal ability to withdraw our label and veto that decision. The EU Plus Pact also wants us to ensure wages in the public sector only increase at a modest pace, equal to or below inflation rate, as this has a strong signalling effect on wage setting in the private sector. Now, this one's fairly self-explanatory, except that, especially in this country, the majority of workers for private companies tend to earn much less than their counterparts in the public sector, which of course is being cut savagely. Now, bear in mind, all of this and all of these measures are to deal with the depression following the banking crisis in 2008. And the banks who got bailed out by the taxpayer, us, and then paid all the executives millions of pounds in bonuses, they still to this day haven't suffered a single arrest or criminal investigation for their carelessness and seem to have gotten away scot-free, while all the suffering has been passed down onto normal workers like us. Now, I've heard a lot about the EU protecting workers' rights as well, which I'll say workers' rights come from a century of organised workers in trade unions and community campaigns, selflessly sacrificing themselves for a better lot for us all. That's where they come from, and certainly don't come from the EU. A lot of them predate the EU. However, the EU does protect some of these rights, but also the EU directives also only apply to public bodies and not to private ones, which is only 17% of the population. Not only that, after the Localism Act of Parliament, which was also 2011, more private contractors are taking on public work. Which basically means that EU laws that do protect workers are essentially going to cover less and less of Britain's employees. So in conclusion to this, it's better to be a member of a trade union than it is to be a member of the European Union. So that's the single market. I think it's a bad thing. I think we're better off without it. Next up, I'm going to be addressing freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is something that I'm definitely for. but I also want it on a larger scale, not just between European states, but I think all humans should have a right to travel to any piece of rock sticking out the sea that they should, but I'll address that in the next video. I've got some of my sources below, so check them out, but if you've got any more questions, just add a comment below and I'll try and get back to you. If not, I'll address it in a future video. Thanks.